In early 1944, Nazi Germany found itself in a precarious position on the Eastern Front. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in 1943, followed by Soviet advances through Ukraine and Belarus, had shifted the balance of power. Hitler's grip on his Axis allies began to loosen, particularly in regions where internal pressures, military failures, and foreign influence posed a growing threat to Germany's strategic depth. One such case was Hungary, a country that had been a loyal, though increasingly reluctant ally of the Third Reich since the early years of the war. Hungary had joined the Axis powers in 1940, motivated by revanchist aims following the Treaty of Trianon, which had stripped the country of two-thirds of its territory. Under Regent Miklós Horthy, the Hungarian regime hoped alliance with Germany would allow the reclamation of these lands. Indeed, Hungary participated in the invasions of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, and in return was granted parts of Transylvania and other former territories. However, by 1943, the Hungarian leadership had grown disillusioned. The war had taken a heavy toll, and the tide was clearly turning in favor of the Allies. Horthy and many within the Hungarian political and military elite began to quietly seek an exit from the Axis alliance. Secret contacts were initiated with the Western Allies, and the possibility of an armistice with the Soviet Union was cautiously explored. This alarmed Hitler. He had seen Italy's defection in 1943, which had forced Germany into a costly and prolonged occupation of the Italian peninsula. Hungary, positioned directly on Germany's southeastern flank, held immense strategic value. It was a key supplier of raw materials, especially bauxite and oil, and hosted large German troop concentrations. A sudden collapse or defection could open a dangerous breach. In response, Hitler authorized Operation Margarethe, a plan to occupy Hungary and bring it firmly under German control. The operation was meticulously planned and executed with the intention of maintaining the facade of Hungarian sovereignty, while eliminating any capacity for independent decision-making. The Wehrmacht would enter Hungary under the pretext of reinforcing Axis cooperation, but in effect, it would impose full German oversight on Hungarian political, military, and administrative functions. The opportunity to launch the operation came in March 1944. Horthy had accepted a German invitation to meet Hitler at Klesheim Castle, near Salzburg, on March 15th. While Horthy and his entourage were away from the capital, German forces initiated the occupation. On March 19, 1944, German troops crossed into Hungary unopposed. Key installations were secured, communications monitored, and transportation hubs seized. The operation was swift, methodical, and crucially, bloodless. The Hungarian army, unprepared and politically divided, did not resist. Upon returning to Budapest, Horthy was presented with a fait accompli. Under German pressure, he agreed to appoint a new government led by Dom Stojai, a pro-German diplomat and former ambassador to Berlin. Though Horthy remained head of state in name, his power was now purely symbolic. The German Reich had effectively transformed Hungary into a puppet state, preserving the appearance of continuity while exercising full control behind the scenes. Operation Margarethe marked a turning point not only for Hungary's role in the war, but also for the fate of Hungarian Jewry. Until then, despite its alliance with Germany, Hungary had resisted the wholesale deportation of its Jewish population. Anti-Semitic laws had been enacted, and thousands had been sent to labor battalions, but mass deportations were avoided, partly due to Horthy's reluctance and partly due to fear of international condemnation. That restraint ended with the German occupation. The SS moved quickly to implement the final solution in Hungary. Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, arrived in Budapest within days of the occupation. Working through Hungarian collaborators and the newly empowered Arrow Cross elements, Eichmann began organizing the systematic roundup of Jews across the country. The infrastructure for deportation, census data, railway timetables, ghetto planning, was already in place. What had been lacking was the political authority to act without restraint. Operation Margarethe provided that authority. In the months that followed, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz and other extermination camps. Most were murdered upon arrival. It was one of the most rapid and devastating operations of the Holocaust. German control over Hungary enabled a machinery of genocide that operated with brutal efficiency, transforming the political occupation into one of the darkest chapters in modern European history. At the same time, Operation Margarethe had strategic consequences for the German war effort. It temporarily secured the southeastern front and ensured that Hungary would continue to provide resources and manpower. However, the occupation also tied down German divisions that could have been used elsewhere and deepened the resentment among the Hungarian populace. Resistance, though initially limited, began to grow, and as the Red Army advanced westward, the cost of holding Hungary would increase dramatically. The operation was, in military terms, a success, executed without conflict and achieving its objectives within days. But in strategic terms, it revealed the increasing desperation of the Nazi regime. The need to occupy a supposed ally underscored Germany's declining influence and the crumbling cohesion of the Axis powers. Operation Margarethe preserved German control in the short term, but it could not reverse the trajectory of the war. It was a delaying tactic, a well-executed move that could not mask the inevitability of defeat. The installation of Dom Stoje as prime minister marked the beginning of direct German manipulation of Hungary's internal affairs. Stoje, a staunch pro-German figure, wasted no time aligning the government's policies with Nazi priorities. Under his administration, German officials and SS operatives gained unprecedented access to Hungarian institutions, including the police, intelligence services, and local administrative bodies. Though Hungary retained a facade of sovereignty, every key decision, military, economic, and political, was effectively dictated from Berlin. One of the immediate consequences of the occupation was the overhaul of domestic security and internal order. The Hungarian gendarmerie, a militarized police force, came under partial SS oversight. Local administrators and politicians who had previously expressed skepticism or moderate opposition to Germany's war aims were dismissed or arrested. The apparatus of repression was activated with ruthless speed. German and Hungarian security services coordinated surveillance operations targeting anti-German elements, resistance networks, and Jewish communities. Meanwhile, Hungary's military obligations to the Axis increased sharply. German planners saw the occupation as an opportunity to extract more from Hungary in terms of labor, resources, and troops. Hungarian units were reorganized and redeployed to assist German operations on the Eastern Front, particularly in areas where German losses had created manpower shortages. However, Hungarian military morale remained low, and desertions increased, both among frontline soldiers and within the garrisons inside the country. These problems were compounded by the German policy of executing suspected deserters and partisans without trial, a measure that sowed further resentment. At the same time, Hungary's economy came under intense exploitation. German demands for food, raw materials, and industrial output placed crushing burdens on Hungarian agriculture and manufacturing. German firms, backed by the SS and Wehrmacht, seized control of critical infrastructure and production facilities. Strategic resources like oil and aluminum were requisitioned at preferential rates, draining the Hungarian economy. Black markets flourished, especially in urban centers, as rationing intensified and inflation escalated. Ordinary Hungarians, already weary from years of war, found life increasingly untenable. German domination also extended into cultural and educational spheres. Press censorship tightened. Books deemed anti-fascist or politically suspect were removed from libraries. Universities and schools were ordered to align curricula with Axis ideology, including greater emphasis on racial theories and glorification of the German-Hungarian alliance. Artists, writers, and academics who had spoken out against the war or expressed pro-Allied sentiments were blacklisted, imprisoned, or silenced. The intellectual climate grew repressive, dominated by fear and self-censorship. However, the most catastrophic consequence of Operation Margarethe was the rapid escalation of the Holocaust in Hungary. Within weeks of the German occupation, Adolf Eichmann and his small team of SS officers began preparing for mass deportations. Hungary's Jewish population at the time numbered roughly 825,000, including refugees from neighboring countries. Unlike in other parts of occupied Europe, these communities had largely been spared deportation prior to March 1944. That changed overnight. Eichmann established his operations from the Majestic Hotel in Budapest, coordinating closely with the Hungarian Ministry of the Interior. The deportation plan, drawn up in close consultation with local officials, was unprecedented in its scale and speed. Hungary was divided into 6 zones. In each, Jews were to be concentrated into ghettos or designated urban areas before being transported by train to Auschwitz. The entire operation was scheduled to be completed in a matter of weeks. Between May and July 1944, over 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported, most of them to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The majority were exterminated upon arrival. The operation proceeded with chilling efficiency, aided not only by the SS, but by Hungarian police, civil servants, and railway officials. Resistance from within the government or broader Hungarian society was minimal during this phase, either due to fear, ideological sympathy, or indifference. Only in Budapest, where international diplomats and neutral embassies began intervening, did the deportations slow. As the deportations accelerated, so did foreign alarm. Reports of the mass killings reached the Vatican, neutral governments, and even the Allied press. Pope Pius XII, President Roosevelt, and other leaders issued formal protests. The Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, working from the Swedish legation in Budapest, began issuing protective passports and establishing safe houses to shelter Jews from arrest. Yet these efforts could only mitigate a catastrophe already well underway. Even as the genocide unfolded, Hungary's political and military position deteriorated further. The Eastern Front was moving inexorably westward. The Red Army was approaching the Carpathian Mountains, threatening to cut Hungary off from Germany altogether. Partisan activity in Slovakia, Croatia, and Ukraine disrupted transport lines, and the German military's ability to reinforce its southern flank diminished. Horthy, increasingly aware of Germany's declining fortunes, began once again to explore the possibility of disengaging from the Axis. But Hitler's decision to occupy Hungary had not only eliminated the country's autonomy, it had embedded German forces so deeply into its political and military structure that any move toward neutrality or defection became nearly impossible. Hungarian sovereignty existed now only on paper. The real power lay with German generals, SS officers, and a small circle of Hungarian collaborators whose loyalty was to Berlin, not Budapest. Thus, the success of Operation Margarethe, achieved without bloodshed, had led to a complete transformation of Hungary's wartime role. It had extended the reach of Nazi power deeper into southeastern Europe. It had enabled the most devastating phase of the Holocaust within Hungary's borders, and it had robbed the Hungarian state of its agency at the very moment when such autonomy might have saved tens of thousands of lives. As the summer of 1944 unfolded, the ramifications of Operation Margarethe deepened further. Germany's grip on Hungary, secured through a combination of military presence, political coercion, and administrative subjugation, created a regime in which Hungarian sovereignty was a facade. The country was now a strategic outpost for the Third Reich, but also a pawn in a crumbling imperial structure increasingly reliant on coercion rather than cooperation. The price of this forced loyalty would soon be paid in full, both by Hungary's population and by its political elite. With the deportations of Hungarian Jews from the countryside largely completed by early July, Adolf Eichmann turned his attention to Budapest, home to the largest remaining Jewish population in the country. An estimated 200,000 Jews remained in the capital, many living in terror, others attempting to blend into the general population. Resistance from foreign diplomatic circles, particularly the Swedish, Swiss, and Vatican legations, intensified during this period. Through the work of Raoul Wallenberg, Karl Lutz, and other diplomats, thousands of Jews received protective documents, housing, or employment within neutral institutions. This growing international scrutiny had a direct impact on Regent Miklos Horthy. Although politically isolated and under German pressure, Horthy remained the nominal head of state and retained some capacity to act. Appalled by the scale and brutality of the deportations, and recognizing that German defeat was increasingly probable, Horthy took a rare and dangerous step. On July 6, 1944, he ordered the cessation of Jewish deportations from Budapest. The order, though met with resistance from pro-German factions within the Hungarian government, was largely implemented. Eichmann was furious. The halt in deportations came at a moment when the final phase of the extermination plan was poised to begin. His appeals to Berlin were immediate, but even within the Nazi hierarchy, priorities were shifting. Germany's military situation was deteriorating on all fronts. The Allies had landed in Normandy a month earlier. Soviet forces had launched Operation Bagration in the east, and Romania was on the verge of switching sides. With these mounting crises, Hitler opted not to openly confront Horthy at once. Instead, preparations were quietly made to replace him when the time was right. Meanwhile, Hungary's military and economic situation grew increasingly dire. The Wehrmacht's demand for Hungarian manpower and resources expanded, even as the German military's ability to defend its gains diminished. Hungarian units were sent to reinforce German defenses along the Carpathians and in southern Poland, where Soviet breakthroughs had become frequent. Morale among these troops was low, and desertions increased sharply during the summer months. The Hungarian economy was also nearing collapse. Years of war, combined with German exploitation and Allied bombing raids, had decimated production and trade. Oil and fuel shortages crippled transportation. Inflation soared. In cities like Budapest, basic commodities became scarce, and hunger was widespread. Factories operated at reduced capacity or were repurposed for emergency military needs. Black markets became the primary avenue for accessing food and medicine, often controlled by corrupt networks linked to military or police officials. Social unrest, though still limited in scale, began to simmer. Workers engaged in sporadic strikes. Rural discontent was exacerbated by food requisitions and forced labor programs. Among students, clergy, and elements of the conservative elite, disillusionment with the Axis alliance became more vocal, though few dared speak openly. The sense that Hungary was being sacrificed to serve German ambitions grew more pervasive. The possibility of exiting the war re-emerged as a focal point of Horthy's thinking. Secret contacts were re-established with Allied representatives through intermediaries in neutral countries, particularly Switzerland and Turkey. Plans were drafted for a potential armistice with the Soviets. Horthy, still mindful of Hungary's vulnerability and the presence of German forces on its soil, sought to negotiate a conditional surrender that would preserve the monarchy and prevent occupation. These efforts, however, were closely monitored by German intelligence. The Abwehr and SS had deeply infiltrated Hungarian political circles and were fully aware of Horthy's renewed maneuvering. Hitler, now deeply suspicious of his allies, resolved that Hungary, like Italy before it, could not be trusted to act in the interest of the Reich. By August 1944, with Romania defecting to the Allies and Soviet forces approaching Hungary's borders, Hitler began planning the next phase, the complete political subjugation of Hungary through a regime change. In the meantime, German forces in Hungary shifted into defensive posture. Fortification lines were constructed along key river crossings and mountain passes. Anti-partisan operations intensified in rural areas, particularly in northern and eastern Hungary, where resistance activity was growing. German units worked in coordination with Hungarian paramilitary groups, including members of the fascist Arrow Cross Party, whose influence was steadily rising. The Arrow Cross, under the leadership of Ferenc Szalasi, had long advocated for full alignment with Nazi Germany. Though their influence had been limited before Operation Margarethe, they now gained favor as reliable collaborators. Their ideology, rooted in ultranationalism, racial hatred, and anti-communism, mirrored Nazi doctrine. German officials, dissatisfied with Horthy's interference in the final solution and his cautious diplomacy, saw in Szalasi and his followers a dependable alternative. By September 1944, the situation had become untenable. Soviet forces were closing in on Hungary's eastern frontier, having already reclaimed parts of Romania and advanced through the Carpathian passes. Horthy, despite his efforts to slow or reverse the course of events, found himself trapped. The structure imposed by Operation Margarethe, military occupation, internal repression, and economic exploitation, had rendered Hungary incapable of independent action. Every attempt to assert autonomy was monitored, countered, or crushed. The political stage was set for a final rupture. As Hungary teetered between war and occupation, and as the streets of Budapest swelled with uncertainty, German operatives prepared the final blow that would transform Hungary from a subordinate ally into a nation governed directly by ideological proxy. The next move would come not through negotiation, but through a coup, and it would plunge Hungary into one of the darkest and bloodiest chapters of its wartime history. In October 1944, with Soviet forces pressing at Hungary's eastern borders and Axis fortunes collapsing, the fragile structure imposed by Operation Margarethe reached its breaking point. The German occupation had neutralized Hungary's autonomy, but failed to ensure total compliance. Regent Miklós Horthy, still technically head of state, pursued his final and most consequential act of defiance, a secret armistice with the Soviet Union. This decision, born of desperation and a desire to spare Hungary further devastation, would lead directly to the German-engineered coup that toppled him from power. By early October, Soviet troops had crossed into northeastern Hungary. The Red Army had already swept through Romania, which had defected to the Allies in August, and now threatened to envelop the Carpathian Basin. Horthy and his advisors understood that Hungary had little capacity to resist a full Soviet invasion. German forces, though still stationed throughout the country, were overstretched, and the Hungarian army was demoralized and weakened after years of costly deployments on the Eastern Front. Recognizing that continued resistance would likely result in total occupation and destruction, Horthy reached out to Soviet representatives via contacts in Istanbul and Bern. After secret negotiations, a tentative armistice was agreed upon. On October 15, 1944, Horthy addressed the Hungarian nation by radio. In a dramatic proclamation, he declared that Hungary was ceasing hostilities with the Soviet Union and withdrawing from the Axis alliance. The statement shocked many but was intended to preempt further bloodshed and preserve Hungary's sovereignty in the face of Soviet victory. The announcement, however, came too late, and it was poorly executed. The Hungarian army, fragmented and infiltrated by pro-German officers, failed to respond uniformly. Many units remained loyal to the Germans or simply awaited further orders. Communications were inconsistent, and chaos quickly spread. Worse, the Germans had already anticipated Horthy's move. The SS had been preparing a counter-coup, codenamed Operation Panzerfaust, to eliminate Horthy's regime and install a more compliant government under Ferenc Szalasi and the Arrow Cross. Within hours of Horthy's broadcast, German commandos led by Otto Skorzeny, the same officer who had rescued Mussolini from captivity a year earlier, executed a daring operation in Budapest. They kidnapped Horthy's son, Miklós Jr., who had been involved in armistice negotiations, and used him as leverage. Skorzeny confronted Horthy at Buda Castle, presenting him with an ultimatum: rescind the armistice or his son would be executed. Isolated, unprotected, and faced with a threat to his family, Horthy capitulated. On October 16th, Horthy officially abdicated his position. German forces, already in place throughout the capital, moved swiftly to consolidate control. Ferenc Szalasi, leader of the fascist Arrow Cross Party, was installed as leader of the nation, Nemzetvezető, marking the beginning of one of the most brutal regimes in Hungarian history. The Arrow Cross coup represented the full culmination of Operation Margarethe's objectives, a totalitarian, ideologically aligned regime under direct German influence. With Szalasi in power, Hungary became a full-fledged Nazi satellite, not just in terms of military alliance but in ideology, administration, and policy. The Arrow Cross immediately initiated a reign of terror. Armed paramilitary groups, wearing green armbands, roamed the streets of Budapest, targeting political dissidents, Jews, suspected partisans, and anyone deemed insufficiently loyal to the new regime. The rule of law collapsed. Public executions, arbitrary arrests, and mass disappearances became daily occurrences. The regime revived and intensified the final solution. Although most of Hungary's Jews outside Budapest had already been deported earlier in the year, over 200,000 Jews remained in the capital. Under Arrow Cross oversight and with Eichmann returning briefly to Hungary, deportations resumed. However, with Soviet forces rapidly approaching and transportation lines disrupted, deportations increasingly took the form of forced death marches. Thousands of Jews were driven westward on foot toward Austria under inhumane conditions. Many perished from exhaustion, exposure, or were murdered en route by guards. Within Budapest, the Arrow Cross began mass killings of Jews directly within the city. Hundreds were rounded up, taken to the banks of the Danube River and shot, their bodies thrown into the water. These murders were conducted systematically and publicly, with little attempt to conceal them. The city's streets and buildings bore witness to a regime that viewed terror not as a tool, but as a governing principle. Despite this brutality, elements of resistance continued to operate within Hungary. Foreign diplomats, including Raoul Wallenberg, Karl Lutz, and Giorgio Perlasca, intensified their efforts to save lives. Working under the protection of neutral embassies, they issued false identity papers, established protected houses, and negotiated with Arrow Cross officials to spare individuals or families. Their actions saved thousands, though many more could not be reached in time. Military developments rapidly overtook the new regime. By November 1944, the Red Army had surrounded Budapest. Soviet artillery began bombarding the outskirts of the city, signaling the beginning of the siege of Budapest. Szalasi's government, while nominally still in power, was in retreat, physically relocating to western Hungary as the front lines drew closer to the capital. German forces, along with loyal Hungarian units, prepared for a last-ditch defense of the city which would become one of the most devastating urban battles of the war. The Arrow Cross regime's control over Budapest during these final months was marked by desperation, cruelty, and collapse. With the city encircled, food supplies dwindled, and public services ceased to function. Civilians took shelter in cellars and underground tunnels. Jews who had survived the earlier purges were now confined to ghettos, under constant threat of execution or starvation. The once grand capital was reduced to a battlefield and a prison, its fate sealed by the decisions and betrayals set in motion months earlier during Operation Margarethe. Thus, the coup of October 1944 completed Germany's transformation of Hungary from a sovereign ally into a controlled outpost of Nazi brutality. Horthy's final attempt to extricate his country from the war had failed. What followed was a descent into chaos and genocide, orchestrated not only by German forces but by Hungarian collaborators who embraced a radical vision of national rebirth through destruction. The consequences would reverberate long after the last shot was fired. As 1944 drew to a close, Hungary, now fully subjugated under the Arrow Cross regime and German military authority, descended into a vortex of destruction. The political and military structures imposed by Operation Margarethe had culminated in the total annihilation of the country's independence. Ferenc Szalasi's fascist government, propped up by the Wehrmacht and SS, presided over a territory that was no longer a functioning state, but a collapsing battlefield and a staging ground for atrocities. Szalasi's ideological goals were ambitious and delusional. He envisioned a Hungary cleansed of foreign elements, militarized from top to bottom, and capable of withstanding both Bolshevik and capitalist threats. But he assumed power at a time when the physical foundations of governance, territory, resources, infrastructure, and military capacity were rapidly disintegrating. The Arrow Cross Party, composed of radicalized paramilitary elements and ideological zealots, had little practical experience in governance. Their rise to power unleashed an explosion of arbitrary violence and administrative chaos. The regime's internal policies revolved around terror, ideological purity, and total mobilization. Political opponents, real or imagined, were hunted down. Former Horthy loyalists, anti-fascists, and even moderate conservatives were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Prisons overflowed, and ad hoc detention centers sprang up in basements, schools, and government buildings. The Aerocross militia operated with near-total autonomy, executing civilians, looting homes, and using torture as an instrument of policy. The Jewish population of Budapest, the last major group of Jews remaining in Hungary, faced systematic extermination. Approximately 70,000 Jews were confined within the city's central ghetto, established in November 1944. Another 20,000 to 30,000 lived in so-called protected houses under the patronage of foreign embassies. Conditions in the ghetto rapidly deteriorated. Food was scarce, sanitation collapsed, and disease spread. Daily roundups occurred, with victims often executed on the banks of the Danube or deported in death marches toward Austria. Despite the horrific conditions, efforts to rescue Jewish citizens intensified. Raoul Wallenberg and other diplomats continued to issue protective papers and personally intervene with Aerocross officials. In many cases, they used bribery, deception, and direct confrontation to prevent deportations or gain the release of prisoners. Their efforts were supported by a loose network of Hungarian civilians who risked their lives to hide Jews or assist them in escaping capture. These acts of moral courage stood in stark contrast to the brutal indifference of the regime. As Soviet forces advanced, German and Hungarian military commands scrambled to consolidate defenses. The capital was declared a fortress city, Festung Budapest, and German Field Marshal Karl Pfeffer-Wildenbruck was tasked with organizing its defense. Hungarian forces, already depleted and demoralized, were subordinated to German command. The Aerocross contributed irregular militia units, but their effectiveness in battle was limited. The city's strategic importance, lying at the confluence of the Danube and controlling access to Austria and southern Germany, meant that both sides prepared for a decisive confrontation. The siege of Budapest began in earnest on December 29, 1944. Soviet and Romanian forces encircled the city, cutting off all supply routes. Inside, an estimated 800,000 civilians were trapped, along with over 100,000 Axis soldiers. The siege would last more than 50 days, becoming one of the most destructive urban battles of the Second World War. Constant artillery bombardment, street fighting, and aerial attacks turned large sections of the city into rubble. Life during the siege was marked by unimaginable hardship. Food supplies ran out within weeks. Civilians survived on animal feed, scavenged scraps, or boiled leather. Water was drawn from bomb craters and melted snow. Thousands died from hunger, disease, and exposure. The Aerocross continued its reign of terror, executing suspected dissenters and murdering Jews even as the Soviet noose tightened around the city. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and dead bodies piled up in basements and courtyards. German and Hungarian forces launched repeated counterattacks in a desperate attempt to break the encirclement, but Soviet forces, reinforced and supplied, gradually crushed all resistance. Attempts by Hitler to send relief through Operation Conrad failed to penetrate the siege. Within the city, the situation for defenders became untenable. Ammunition dwindled, coordination broke down, and discipline deteriorated. German officers began to destroy archives and evacuate selected personnel, signaling an imminent collapse. In this atmosphere of collapse and desperation, the Aerocross government fled the capital. Szalasi, having declared himself the embodiment of the Hungarian nation, relocated westward to areas still under German control. There, his so-called government in exile continued to issue decrees and conduct propaganda broadcasts, though it held no real power. In Budapest, local Aerocross leaders carried on their terror campaign until the very end, even as Soviet forces breached the inner districts. On February 13, 1945, the siege of Budapest officially ended. The Red Army declared the city liberated after more than 100,000 casualties, soldiers and civilians, had fallen. Most of the German and Hungarian defenders were either killed or captured. Budapest lay in ruins, its bridges destroyed, its neighborhoods leveled, its population decimated. Of the 70,000 Jews in the central ghetto, fewer than 50,000 survived. The protected houses saved thousands more, but at immense cost and risk. The consequences of Operation Margarethe had reached their terminal point. What had begun as a calculated occupation to ensure political loyalty had led, through a series of escalations and reactions, to total devastation. Germany's attempt to hold Hungary within the Axis orbit had prolonged the war in southeastern Europe, facilitated one of the most rapid and violent phases of the Holocaust, and subjected Hungary's capital to annihilation. The Arrow-Cross regime, created as a tool of German control, left behind a legacy of terror that would define Hungary's wartime history and stain its national memory. The battle for Hungary was not yet over, but the destruction of Budapest marked the collapse of any meaningful Axis presence in the region. The Soviet advance would continue westward into Austria and Germany, while Hungary, now occupied and broken, would begin the long and painful process of reckoning with the war it had been pulled deeper into, first as an ally, then as a hostage. With the fall of Budapest in February 1945, Hungary's role in the Second World War entered its final phase, one marked by military collapse, occupation, and the slow, painful disintegration of the structures erected by both the Axis alliance and its local collaborators. The consequences of Operation Margarethe, which had begun nearly a year earlier as a swift German takeover to secure Hungary's loyalty, had now fully materialized. What remained was a shattered state, a traumatized population, and a country caught between retreating German forces and the advancing Soviet war machine. In the aftermath of the siege, the Red Army established full control over Budapest and rapidly expanded its occupation across the rest of Hungarian territory. German resistance, though still present in western Hungary and along key defensive lines near Lake Balaton, was largely symbolic. The Wehrmacht was in full strategic retreat, and German commanders focused on delaying the inevitable Soviet advance toward Austria and southern Germany. The remnants of Hungary's military, disorganized and fragmented, either surrendered or joined the flow of Axis refugees fleeing westward. The Arrow-Cross regime, now reduced to a mobile government in exile, had relocated to western Hungary and later into Austria. Ferenc Szalasi, clinging to delusions of ideological permanence, continued issuing decrees from his retreating headquarters even as his state apparatus crumbled. The regime's final acts were a mixture of futility and fanaticism, executions of prisoners, the forced conscription of civilians, and attempts to relocate Jewish captives westward into German territory. The brutality persisted even in retreat, especially along the so-called death marches of Jewish prisoners, during which thousands perished from exposure, starvation, and violence. In the vacuum left by the Axis collapse, Soviet military command and political operatives began the rapid implementation of post-war structures. Hungarian communists, many of whom had been in exile in Moscow, were flown into Debrecen and Budapest to participate in the formation of provisional governance. The Soviet-backed Provisional National Government, initially seated in Debrecen, had been declared in December 1944, but its authority had been largely symbolic until the capture of Budapest. With the capital secured, it gained effective control. This new government, dominated by the Hungarian Communist Party under the leadership of Bela Miklós and soon Matyas Rákosi, began the process of dismantling what remained of the old regime. War criminals, collaborators, and Arrow-Cross officials were rounded up. People's tribunals were established to conduct trials of those accused of participation in war crimes, deportations, and atrocities. Many were sentenced to death or long prison terms, though the judicial process was often influenced by Soviet political objectives rather than due process. The social and economic landscape the new government inherited was catastrophic. The siege of Budapest had destroyed vital infrastructure: bridges, factories, public utilities, and transportation networks. Railways had been targeted by both German retreating forces and Soviet artillery. Power plants were offline. Food supplies had been exhausted. Hunger and disease continued to claim lives after the fighting stopped. Typhus outbreaks swept through refugee camps and bombed out neighborhoods. Medical care was minimal and clean water was scarce, In the countryside, entire regions had been depopulated by forced conscription, deportations, and retreating armies. Farms lay fallow. Livestock had been requisitioned or killed, and irrigation systems damaged. Agricultural production fell to a fraction of its pre-war level. The Red Army requisitioned what little remained officially for the war effort, though widespread looting by undisciplined troops compounded the suffering of civilians. Rape, theft, and abuse were tragically common during the early months of occupation, phenomena mirrored elsewhere in Eastern Europe as the Red Army pushed westward. Despite these dire conditions, efforts to rebuild began almost immediately. The provisional government launched emergency programs to restore transportation, reopen schools, and distribute food. The Soviet Union, intent on securing Hungary within its post-war sphere, facilitated some reconstruction, primarily in the form of industrial repairs and agricultural redistribution. Yet even as the foundations of recovery were being laid, the seeds of political repression were sown. The Communist Party, backed by Soviet authority, used the chaotic post-war environment to eliminate rivals. Former members of the Independent Smallholders Party, Social Democrats, and other non-communist factions were gradually excluded from meaningful political power through a combination of arrests, purges, and electoral manipulation. The National Assembly, elected in 1945 under relatively free conditions, gave the smallholders a majority. But by 1947, following a series of purges and fabricated conspiracy charges, the infamous salami tactics, the communists had consolidated power. The legacy of Operation Margarethe remained visible in every part of this transition. The German occupation had destroyed Hungary's last opportunities for an independent negotiated exit from the war. It had brought the Holocaust to Hungarian soil with full force. It had empowered the Arrow Cross and led to the total collapse of state authority. In the wake of that collapse, the Soviet Union filled the vacuum, not simply with tanks and soldiers, but with an ideological and political project that would dominate Hungary for the next 4 decades. Hungarian society, traumatized and fragmented, had little room to reflect. Survival took precedence. Families searched for missing relatives, buried their dead, and attempted to resume shattered lives. Jewish survivors emerged from hiding, ghettos, and labor camps to find homes destroyed and communities erased. The return to normalcy was slow, uneven, and haunted by memory. In the international arena, Hungary's fate was sealed in the broader context of the post-war settlement. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences confirmed Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. Hungary, like Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia, would fall behind the Iron Curtain. The wartime decisions of Germany, its invasion, occupation, and manipulation of Hungarian sovereignty, had ensured that Hungary would not only lose the war, but also its freedom. As 1945 progressed, the question was no longer who ruled Hungary, but how deep Soviet influence would reach, and whether Hungarian identity could survive the twin devastations of fascist collaboration and communist control. In that sense, Operation Margarethe did more than destroy Hungary's wartime independence. It helped pave the way for its post-war submission. By the middle of 1945, the full implications of Operation Margarethe had rippled through every facet of Hungarian society, leaving behind a nation physically devastated, politically subjugated, and morally fractured. Although the war in Europe had ended in May, Hungary's internal reckoning had only just begun. The process of accounting for the country's role in the conflict, its alliance with Nazi Germany, the complicity of its institutions in the Holocaust, and the collapse of its sovereignty under German occupation, was fraught, complex, and deeply painful. One of the most immediate post-war tasks was the prosecution of war crimes. The Hungarian People's Tribunals, established under the authority of the Provisional Government, began trying former Arrow Cross officials, military personnel, and civilian collaborators. These tribunals, modeled on similar institutions being created elsewhere in post-war Europe, aimed to deliver justice and to delegitimize the structures that had enabled fascist rule. Trials were held publicly, often in converted theaters or assembly halls, with large audiences in attendance and media coverage intended to reinforce the message of accountability. Among those prosecuted were members of the Arrow Cross Party, gendarmerie officers who had participated in deportations and executions, and bureaucrats who had facilitated the seizure of Jewish property. The trials were harsh, and the sentences frequently severe. Many high-profile figures were executed, including former Prime Minister Dum Stoje and several Aerocross ministers. Ferenc Szalasi himself, captured by American forces and handed over to Hungary, was tried in 1946 and hanged the same year. Yet while the tribunals were presented as instruments of justice, they also served as a political tool. The Communist Party, rapidly consolidating power, used the process to weaken political rivals and suppress dissent. The definition of collaborator became increasingly vague, and accusations were often levied on the basis of personal enmity or ideological deviation. The line between justice and vengeance blurred, and while many genuine war criminals were punished, others were caught up in a widening net of politically motivated repression. Reparations and reconstruction dominated the country's economic agenda. As part of the post-war settlement, Hungary was required to pay reparations to the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. These were to be paid in kind: industrial goods, agricultural products, and raw materials, placing an enormous burden on a shattered economy. Factories, railroads, and energy systems had to be rebuilt under strict quotas and tight deadlines. Much of this work was coordinated under Soviet oversight, effectively placing Hungarian reconstruction under foreign control. The human cost of the war and occupation became clearer with each passing month. Hundreds of thousands of Hungarians had died during the war, on the battlefield, in bombings, in labor camps, or during the Holocaust. Over 600,000 Hungarian Jews had perished, the overwhelming majority of them deported to Auschwitz in the months following Operation Margarethe. Those who survived returned to a society that was often indifferent, if not openly hostile. Property restitution was slow and incomplete. Anti-Semitism, while politically repressed, remained a social undercurrent. The psychological and cultural impact of the war also began to surface. Artists, writers, and intellectuals struggled to process the enormity of what had occurred. In the ruins of Budapest, small literary circles and theater groups revived, seeking to express both the trauma and the moral disillusionment of the past 5 years. Censorship under Soviet occupation limited the scope of public expression, but private reflection and coded allegory became powerful tools. The generation that had come of age during the war carried deep scars, memories of siege, starvation, betrayal, and survival that would inform Hungarian literature and historiography for decades. Among the broader population, attitudes toward the recent past were ambivalent and conflicted. Some viewed the German occupation as a necessary evil in the face of Bolshevik threat. Others saw it as a catastrophic betrayal that had dragged Hungary into genocide and national ruin. Horthy himself, living in exile in Portugal, remained a symbol of controversy. To some, a patriot who tried to protect Hungarian sovereignty; to others, a collaborator who failed to prevent his country's descent into fascism. Public debate over these legacies was constrained by the political environment, but simmered beneath the surface. The social fabric of Hungary had also changed. The Holocaust had effectively destroyed one of the country's most vibrant communities. Before the war, Hungary had been home to the largest Jewish population in Central Europe. After 1945, that community had been reduced by more than 2/3. Synagogues stood empty or damaged. Once thriving neighborhoods were depopulated. Cultural institutions were gone. While some survivors attempted to rebuild their lives in Hungary, many emigrated, seeking safety and new beginnings abroad. For the Communist Party, these conditions provided both opportunity and justification. They portrayed themselves as the force of modernization, justice, and anti-fascism. The legacy of Operation Margarethe was used rhetorically to justify the imposition of radical change. Hungary's pre-war elites had failed, they argued: the monarchy, the gentry, the conservatives, even the liberal bourgeoisie. Only socialism, under Soviet protection, could prevent a recurrence of the catastrophe. This message resonated with many Hungarians exhausted by war and uncertain about the future. By late 1945 and into 1946, the Communist Party steadily expanded its control over key institutions: police, judiciary, media, and economic planning agencies. Elections held in November 1945 were nominally free, and the Independent Smallholders Party won a majority. But the Communists, backed by Soviet authority, refused to relinquish key ministries. Over the next 2 years, through a mixture of coercion, infiltration, and staged scandals, they dismantled the opposition. What remained was a one-party state in all but name, soon to be formally established as the People's Republic of Hungary. Thus, the shadow of Operation Margarethe extended far beyond its military and political goals. It had initiated a sequence of events that dismantled Hungary's political independence, facilitated one of the deadliest phases of the Holocaust, and left the country vulnerable to Soviet domination. The occupation may have lasted only months in its initial form, but its consequences shaped Hungary's trajectory for decades. The wounds it opened, moral, social, and political, would never fully heal. By 1946, Hungary had entered a new era, one ostensibly defined by reconstruction and renewal, but underpinned by deep geopolitical subordination and unresolved national trauma. The effects of Operation Margarethe, although increasingly overtaken by Soviet political dominance, remained foundational in shaping the conditions that allowed Hungary's transformation into a communist satellite state. The occupation had crushed the last remnants of independent governance, emboldened extremist forces, and paved the way for Soviet-aligned elites to fill the void left by fascism's collapse. One of the starkest indicators of this transformation was the complete dismantling of Hungary's traditional political system. The monarchy, which had existed in a symbolic capacity under Horthy's regency since 1920, was formally abolished in early 1946. The country was declared a republic with Zoltán Tildy, a Protestant pastor and moderate from the Smallholders Party, named president. The government, however, remained under intense Soviet scrutiny, and actual power increasingly shifted into the hands of the Hungarian Communist Party and its General Secretary, Matyas Rákosi. Rákosi, a Stalinist hardliner who had spent years in exile in Moscow, quickly emerged as the dominant political figure in post-war Hungary. Fluent in ideological manipulation and adept at using fear as a tool, he embarked on a gradual consolidation of power, frequently invoking the Arrow Cross Terror and Operation Margarethe as evidence of the fascist danger that could return if the Communist Party did not maintain firm control. Rákosi's narrative cast communists as the only legitimate anti-fascist force, thereby justifying the exclusion and eventual elimination of other political actors. This campaign was reinforced by systematic propaganda. State-controlled newspapers, radio broadcasts, and political pamphlets emphasized the horrors of German occupation and the complicity of Hungarian elites in Nazi crimes. While much of this was historically accurate, the framing served a clear political agenda to delegitimize rivals and consolidate the Communist Party's role as moral and administrative heir to a new Hungary. The trauma of Operation Margarethe became a political instrument, selectively remembered, ideologically filtered, and endlessly invoked. Simultaneously, a program of rapid social and economic transformation was launched. Land reform had begun in 1945 with the redistribution of large estates to peasants. Initially popular, it quickly became a vehicle for communist influence in the countryside. Peasant cooperatives, agricultural unions, and rural party organizations were used to monitor, influence, and eventually collectivize the rural population. Former landowners were marginalized, arrested, or forced into exile. The middle class, which had once formed the backbone of urban civil society, faced increasing taxation, surveillance, and ideological pressure. In the cities, industrial reconstruction moved hand in hand with nationalization. Key industries, mining, steel, transport, energy, were brought under state control. This process was framed as necessary both for recovery and for national security, particularly in light of the previous regime's dependence on foreign capital and German military interests. While some reconstruction projects succeeded in restoring production, They also laid the groundwork for a planned economy increasingly dictated by Soviet models and directives. The social composition of Hungary changed dramatically. The wartime decimation of the Jewish population, the exile or suppression of aristocrats and conservative politicians, and the targeted persecution of bourgeois elements created a new, narrower political base. The Communist Party actively promoted a new cadre of reliable workers, soldiers, and peasant leaders, many of whom had limited education or experience but expressed unwavering ideological loyalty. These individuals were elevated into positions of influence in local councils, factories, schools, and the media, becoming the visible face of the new order. Yet beneath the surface of this transformation, Hungarian society remained unsettled. The memory of war, occupation, and collaboration was ever present. Operation Margarethe had left a psychic imprint on the population. Many had participated in or witnessed acts of collaboration, resistance, violence, and silence. The forced proximity of Hungarian institutions to Nazi authority and the active role played by local officials in the deportation of Jews and suppression of dissent created enduring moral dissonance. This tension was compounded by the silence imposed on certain aspects of the past. While Nazi crimes and Arrow Cross atrocities were publicly condemned, the complexity of Hungarian complicity was often flattened into a binary of fascists and anti-fascists, a narrative that left little room for personal reflection, nuance, or reconciliation. Likewise, the suffering inflicted by the Soviet liberation, rape, looting, arbitrary arrests, was rarely discussed openly. The official history allowed for no ambiguity. The Germans had been evil, the Soviets liberators, and the Communist Party the redeemers of the Hungarian nation. In education and public memory, this version of history was institutionalized. School curricula were revised to reflect a Marxist-Leninist interpretation of the war. Museums, memorials, and state holidays focused on the liberation of Hungary and the defeat of fascism. The events of March 1944, the German occupation, and the rise of the Arrow Cross were commemorated, but always with a political subtext that justified the present regime. The experience of Operation Margarethe was thus preserved not as a warning against authoritarianism in all forms, but as a stepping stone in the ideological evolution toward socialism. At the international level, Hungary's position was formalized through its participation in the post-war Soviet bloc. The 1947 Paris peace treaties restored Hungary's pre-1938 borders, reaffirmed its status as an aggressor state, and mandated reparations. Soviet military presence remained, justified as a stabilizing force. The Western Allies, increasingly focused on post-war reconstruction in Western Europe and the containment of communism, had little leverage to intervene. Hungary's fate had been sealed by its wartime decisions and the consequences of occupation. Thus, Operation Margarethe had done more than secure German interests during the final year of the war. It had broken the last independent institutions of Hungarian statehood, opened the door to extremist rule, and ultimately ensured Hungary's absorption into a new sphere of foreign domination. The political void created in March 1944 had never been refilled by domestic consensus. It had merely changed hands, first to German generals and SS officers, then to Soviet commissars and communist functionaries. By the end of 1946, Hungary no longer resembled the country it had been before the war. The political parties of the interwar period were gone. The Jewish community, once vibrant and numerous, had been devastated. The old elite had been dismantled or exiled, and the memory of 1944, of the occupation that started with deception and ended in fire, lingered in quiet conversations, private grief, and repressed memory. The future was no longer to be found in Budapest's parliament or the dreams of national restoration, but in Moscow's directives and the iron grip of the emerging Cold War. By 1947, the long-term consequences of Operation Margarethe had begun to fully reveal themselves, not only in Hungary's political realignment, but in the deep structural damage inflicted on its institutions, population, and post-war identity. What had begun in March 1944 as a German military occupation designed to secure Hungary's loyalty evolved into a chain of irreversible transformations. These affected virtually every level of society: political elites, minorities, the military, the working class, and the broader cultural fabric of the nation. For the political class, Operation Margarethe marked the abrupt and terminal collapse of Hungarian sovereignty. Regent Miklós Horthy, who had sought to navigate a course between Axis loyalty and national autonomy, was outmaneuvered and neutralized. His removal and the installation of Ferenc Szalasi's Arrow-Cross regime destroyed any remaining pretense of Hungarian political independence. The country ceased to function as a sovereign actor in international affairs. Hungarian diplomats were sidelined, and all major decisions, including military deployments, economic resource allocation, and internal security policy, were made by or through German authorities. This political subjugation had devastating consequences for Hungary's international standing. By aligning itself so completely with Nazi Germany in the final phase of the war, Hungary sealed its fate as an aggressor in the eyes of the Allied powers. The 1947 Paris Peace Treaties stripped Hungary of all territorial gains made since 1938, returned the country to its pre-Trianon borders, and imposed significant reparations. Hungary had once again become a defeated state, a status that both the Soviet Union and the West used to justify their respective post-war agendas. For Hungary's Jewish population, Operation Margarethe marked the beginning of their most immediate and catastrophic tragedy. The occupation allowed Adolf Eichmann and the SS to implement the final solution in Hungary at a pace and scale not previously possible. Between May and July 1944, less than 3 months after the German occupation, over 437,000 Jews were deported, most to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The deportation process was enabled by the Hungarian state using Hungarian railways, gendarmerie, and bureaucratic structures. While pre-war anti-Semitic legislation had laid the groundwork, it was Operation Margarethe that allowed the machinery of genocide to operate without constraint. The destruction of Hungarian Jewry had lasting demographic and cultural consequences. Before the war, Hungary had one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe, deeply integrated into the country's economic, academic, and artistic life. The Holocaust decimated this community, and those who survived often found post-war Hungary to be inhospitable. Many survivors faced restitution challenges, ongoing anti-Semitism, or bureaucratic hostility. A large portion chose emigration, particularly to the United States, Israel, or Western Europe. Hungary lost not only a vital part of its population, but also the intellectual and cultural contributions of generations. For the military, Operation Margarethe was equally destructive. The Hungarian army, already weakened by years of war on the Eastern Front, was effectively disarmed of its strategic autonomy. Under Arrow-Cross rule, remaining units were either subordinated to German command or dissolved and replaced by ideologically loyal but militarily ineffective militias. Following the war, Hungary was subject to strict limitations on its military capabilities under the terms of the peace treaty. Veterans of the pre-war and wartime officer corps were purged, imprisoned, or sidelined, while a new military structure emerged under communist supervision, reshaped according to Soviet doctrine. Among the Hungarian working class and peasantry, the occupation and its aftermath produced a complex mixture of victimhood, complicity, and transformation. Many workers had suffered under the interwar regime's inequalities and found themselves equally marginalized during the war. Operation Margarethe intensified their hardship, worsening rationing, labor conscription, and the collapse of basic services. In the immediate post-war period, the Communist Party used this experience to cultivate a narrative of class betrayal, that Hungary's aristocracy and bourgeoisie had sold out the nation to the Nazis, and that only the working people, guided by socialism, could rebuild a just society. This message resonated with portions of the population who had borne the brunt of wartime suffering. The result was a new political culture that emphasized ideological clarity over pluralism, collective identity over individual agency, and centralized control over democratic governance. The trauma of German occupation was repurposed to justify the imposition of a new authoritarian order, this time under Soviet auspices. In a cruel irony, one foreign-imposed system of domination had been replaced by another, each claiming to liberate the country while dismantling its sovereignty. The cultural consequences of Operation Margarethe were more diffuse but equally profound. The war, occupation, and Holocaust fundamentally reshaped how Hungarians viewed themselves and their place in Europe, a country that had once prided itself on its cultural sophistication, its complex identity as a Central European power, and its independent path between East and West now found itself deeply compromised. Intellectuals wrestled with the legacy of collaboration, the silence of the majority, and the moral collapse of institutions once seen as stable. In the post-war years, these themes would be addressed only obliquely, often through literature, theater, or underground publications. The role of the Catholic Church and other religious institutions during the occupation also came under scrutiny. While some clerics protected Jews or opposed Arrow Cross brutality, others supported the regime or remained silent. After the war, the communist authorities leveraged these associations to justify nationalizing church property, suppressing religious education, and imprisoning outspoken clergy. The church's political influence was systematically dismantled, and religion itself was pushed to the margins of public life, a process that would accelerate in the Stalinist years. On the geopolitical level, Operation Margarethe ensured Hungary's entrenchment within the Soviet sphere of influence. The occupation had created a strategic vacuum, filled first by German troops and then by the Red Army. Hungary's inability to chart its own path in 1944 meant that its post-war alignment was determined not by diplomacy but by force. The Soviets had not liberated a neutral country. They had inherited a battleground nation thoroughly entangled in Nazi structures. That inheritance gave them license to impose sweeping political and ideological transformations with little opposition from the Western Allies. In retrospect, Operation Margarethe stands not only as a tactical occupation, but as a fulcrum of irreversible change. It extinguished Hungary's last attempt to reclaim political agency in the final stages of the war. It enabled the murder of hundreds of thousands of Hungarian citizens. It fractured society, destroyed pluralism, and opened the way for Soviet domination. For Hungary, it was a moment of forced submission with generational consequences. And though the occupation itself lasted only months, its legacy would endure in the structures of dictatorship, the silences of public memory, and the shadow it cast over Hungary's 20th century. As Hungary emerged from the wreckage of World War II, the long shadow of Operation Margarethe continued to loom over its national identity, historical memory, and political trajectory. Though German troops had left the country in defeat and the fascist Arrow Cross regime had been dismantled, the structures and consequences set in motion by the March 1944 occupation left permanent scars that would shape the country's post-war evolution, distort its narrative of the past, and define its place in the Cold War order. In the immediate post-war years, Hungary transitioned rapidly from shattered republic to Soviet client state. The ideological and administrative vacuum left by the collapse of fascism and the discrediting of the Horthy regime provided fertile ground for the ascendance of communist power. Within 3 years of Germany's surrender, Hungary had ceased to be a multi-party democracy. By 1949, the People's Republic of Hungary was proclaimed, governed entirely by the Hungarian Working People's Party, an institution built with Soviet guidance and enforced through purges, propaganda, and repression. Operation Margarethe played a central role in legitimizing this political transformation. In the official narrative constructed by the new regime, the German occupation was portrayed as the logical outcome of Hungary's alliance with Western imperialist powers and fascist elites. The collapse of national independence in 1944, the deportation of Jews, and the rise of the Arrow Cross were all attributed to the failures of the pre-war ruling class. Communism was framed as the only viable corrective to these failures, a promise of moral renewal, social justice, and national restoration. This narrative, however, elided the deeper complexities and shared responsibilities of Hungary's wartime choices. the role of Hungarian authorities in facilitating the Holocaust, the widespread support for anti-Semitic legislation before 1944, and the popular complicity in the occupation were minimized or politically instrumentalized. Official history reduced Operation Margarethe to a morality tale, fascism as foreign intrusion, communism as redemption. In doing so, it flattened the moral terrain of the nation's wartime experience and left little room for collective reckoning or open dialogue. For the generation that lived through the occupation, the memory of 1944 was both inescapable and unspeakable. It had brought about not only military defeat and material destruction, but the unraveling of trust in institutions, leadership, and neighbors. It had exposed the fragility of civil society and the brutal potential of ideological extremism. Many survivors of the siege, deportations, and political purges carried this trauma in silence, trauma that could not be voiced under a regime that permitted only sanctioned versions of the past. In private, families passed on fragmented recollections of the day German troops entered the city without resistance, of the radio broadcast announcing the alliance with Hitler, of the moment when neighbors vanished overnight, of the screams along the Danube. These memories persisted alongside public rituals of remembrance that focused more on ideological messaging than authentic commemoration. Monuments were erected to anti-fascist martyrs, textbooks detailed the evils of Nazism and the heroism of Soviet liberators. But the emotional and ethical ambiguities of the time remained largely unexamined. Internationally, Hungary's reputation was indelibly marked by the events of 1944. The role of Hungarian authorities in the Holocaust became a focus of post-war historiography and war crimes trials. Diplomatic efforts to re-enter the Western political community were complicated by this legacy. Although the Cold War would soon divide East and West along ideological lines, the memory of Hungary's wartime actions remained a source of tension both internally and abroad. In the decades that followed, historians, dissidents, and survivors worked slowly to reintroduce complexity into the national conversation. Underground publications, samizdat memoirs, and émigré journals attempted to document the events of Operation Margarethe outside the bounds of official censorship. After 1989, with the collapse of communist rule, these voices finally came to the forefront. The opening of archives, the erection of Holocaust memorials, and the reevaluation of national myths began to reshape public understanding of the German occupation. Yet even in the post-communist period, debates over Operation Margarethe remained politically charged. Competing narratives clashed over the extent of Hungarian responsibility, the role of resistance versus collaboration, and the legacy of Horthy's final years. Some sought to rehabilitate elements of the wartime regime in the name of nationalism. Others worked to preserve the memory of those who suffered under both fascism and communism. The occupation had not only altered the course of the war in Hungary, it had divided the memory of the war itself. In the end, Operation Margarethe was not just a military maneuver or political intervention. It was a rupture, one that exposed the fragility of sovereignty, the perils of ideological alliances, and the human capacity for both cruelty and courage. It transformed Hungary from an uneasy Axis ally into a battleground for totalitarian ambitions and left the country vulnerable to a new kind of domination after the war's end. Its consequences, strategic, demographic, moral, outlived both the Nazi and communist regimes that used them for their own ends. For historians, Operation Margarethe remains a pivotal episode in the tragic trajectory of 20th century Hungary. For the generations that followed, it offers a somber lesson that the loss of sovereignty, the corrosion of democratic institutions, and the silence of the majority can allow foreign powers not only to occupy a nation, but to rewrite its future. And for the survivors, it marked a point of no return, after which Hungary would never again be the country it was before March 19, 1944.